All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our 2026 legislative session review. We know it's a really busy time of year come May, and so we appreciate you spending the hour with us over lunch. So before we kind of jump into all of the bills and everything that happened during the legislative session, we did want to go over why this matters. And from our perspective, how do we go about it? And we are going to walk through all of the major education wins from this session during this call. And our focus will be on bills that really connect to student outcomes, workforce readiness, accountability, transparency. So this is not meant to be a super deep analysis of every single education bill that was passed and talked about. I think we'd be here for several days if that was the case. So our goal was to give you a high-level overview of what we were tracking and some of the wins that we took out of the legislative session, really focusing on what changed, why it matters, and how it's going to be impacting our students moving forward. So, kind of with that broader context in mind, we organized it around a couple key themes here. And the first one we have is school environment and student focus. There are a couple of policies throughout this presentation that we're going to look at that really focuses on keeping students engaged and supported and ready to learn while they're in the classroom. The second is accountability and transparency. So, this was a major focus throughout the session for legislators and ourselves, making sure that we are investing in education and tracking outcomes as we go along. So, we are understanding what's working, what's not working, and how we can improve. Third, workforce and secondary or post-secondary education pathways. So, there are actually a couple different bills we're going to talk about here that really focus on better connecting high school, higher education, training programs, um, and ultimately the employers with the students so that we can have clearer and better pathways for students after graduation. And fourth, definitely last but not least, is early literacy and long-term outcomes for students. So we are going to really dive into the topic of literacy towards the end of this webinar. And that was a not only a big focus for us, but hopefully the legislature in the coming sessions, as well as this past session, we hit on it just a bit. So as we move through this presentation, feel free to throw questions that you have in the chat. We will have a Q&A at the very end that we're happy to answer any questions you guys have. But as we move through it, I will try to keep an eye on the chat and answer as we go. But anything that we don't catch, we will definitely address at the end. Also, feel free to just write them down and we can open up the discussion at the end for Q&A. So this first theme that we're going to really focus in on is the creating stronger learning environments for students. And I'm sure this is a bill that you all are very aware of. It took up a lot of conversations in the Capitol this session, and rightfully so. There were a couple different bills that were floated out there. Ultimately, we landed on a very strong bell-to-bell cell phone policy. And so, what does this do? It requires the school districts to adopt policies that limit cell phone use during the school day. So, it is bell to bell. And a key aspect of this bill that was really important to get in there was that these devices needed to be stored away from the student. So, they needed to be inaccessible and they just needed to be turned off. A couple other key notes within several of the bills, they did all generally have exceptions. So, exceptions for IEPs, medical needs, health and safety. Those were things that were addressed as they went along the way and ultimately ended up in this bill. So, this bill is it allows for local control. So, implementation for this one is going to be really important as we move into the next couple months in the next school year. One other note about this bill, it was not just the cell phone bill, but there was also an additional aspect that set some clearer rules between employee and student communication via social media. So really narrowing down on that two-way communication on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, not allowing that and saying, okay, as a school district, this is going to be our approved platform for communication. And ideally, that would be a one-way form of communication between students and teachers. The bill actually states all employees of a school district and the students. And so that was an aspect of this bill that's not very much so talked about. But overall, this was one of the bigger wins that we came out of the session with. So this focused on creating learning environments for students, but we also need to know and understand whether students are actually making progress or not. So that brings us to HB 2482, which was the creation of creating at-risk student accountability plans. Really, this is a blueprint for what these accountability plans should be looking like for school districts moving into the 2026-2027 school year. So, what do schools need to do? They need to identify a cohort or a group of students that are considered at risk. Um, Put in place individual measures for evidence-based instructions to help them in the next couple of years. So we're going to be measuring these cohorts of students over 4 to 5 year periods and ultimately reporting out. How are they doing? Are they improving? Are these interventions working? That's really the focus of this to nail down how our students are doing and then what is working and what's helping them throughout this process. One thing that our team was really excited about with this bill was that they started to talk about using longitudinal data to measure progress and to kind of identify what's working and what's not. And that has been a conversation that we've been having for several years now is let's start to look at this data over time and figure out what's working instead of just using one singular pinpoint in time. So this was definitely another big win for us here at Aligned. So the next bill we're going to look at definitely continues with that accountability theme, but this one looks more specifically at the funding and federal funds coming into Kansas. So as you guys can tell, we in Kansas have accept over $1 billion of federal funding every year. Pretty big number. So really what this bill is asking us is where is it going? What funds are being accepted? And it's just a reporting mechanism for more transparency. Pretty simple bill. I will say this bill, towards the very end, so it started off just the federal funds. At the end of the legislative session, this was passed as a broader bill that had quite a few different reporting requirements underneath this. The federal funds transparency was section one of the bill, and there were nearly a dozen other sections that just had different funding mechanisms that you had to go and report out. So this, along with several other bills we're going to talk about today, if this is a bill of interest, please let us know, and we would be more than happy to sit down and go through the very specifics of this bill or any other ones because they encapsulate quite a bit. So to talk about one bill for about 3 minutes is definitely does not do it service. So if you'd like to learn more about this and the other aspects that were included in this bill, we'd be more than happy to sit down and walk through those with you. So this next bill looks at another part of the education landscape, which is the scholarship and scholarship access. So this bill is actually one part of a two-part bill. This was the only aspect that was passed, and it's actually quite simple. It just allows Kansas to participate in the federal tax credit program for individuals who are contributing to a scholarship granting organization. And so Kansas has actually had this at the state level for over 10 years. It was currently as a state level program, still in place after this year. What they wanted to do was go and expand that. That did not pass and was ultimately taken out. But this federal scholarship tax credit program did end up getting passed, which again, it just allows residents of Kansas to claim this individual tax credit for themselves. So again, this is another topic that could probably use its own webinar in and of itself. It's a little bit complex, but ultimately this bill was fairly simple and did not change a whole bunch in terms of what is already going on here in Kansas with the state tax credit program. We're going to transition a little bit to a foster care bill. So this one actually was a long time coming and ultimately seems very common sense. So what does it do? Really, it's helping ensure that as placements change for these kids in foster care, it doesn't create unnecessary disruption within the school as well. So as they're changing placements, this requires DCF to work with school districts and have those records for the students be transferred within 2 business days of being notified. So really making sure there's no delay there with their records so that they can have a seamless transition into the next school. This actually has a really interesting aspect of it as well that pertains to transportation. So I know we've had a lot of conversations going through this. What was, hey, does it include transportation? Does it not? Interestingly enough, it did include it. And so, what does it look like if the student is transferring from one school to the next and it is reasonably, um, if the distance is reasonable and it is appropriate, this bill does require the school districts to work together to create a transportation plan for those students. And so obviously there are cases where kids are being moved from city to city. That's not a reasonable and appropriate circumstance for that to happen. But there are circumstances where bigger cities, Wichita, Kansas City, Topeka, kids can move from school to school and we can still make that transportation aspect happen. So that was their goal in putting that in there. This bill also allows the student to remain in their school of origin if they so choose, and again, if it is appropriate. So that also just kind of created that stability there, ultimately allowing for open enrollment for kids in foster care. So we're now going to move on to the education pathway bundle. That's just what we called it. Ultimately, it was a bill that encapsulated a whole lot of education policy. And again, we could spend our own webinar talking about just this bill. So we pulled out some of the high level issues that we were tracking from the beginning that ultimately got put into this bill. And we're going to walk through some of those policies here now. First, starting with the workforce Pell expansion. So this is really important because it connects education policy directly to workforce needs and short-term credentials. So traditionally, these Pell Grants were tied to longer college programs, and this section just creates a process for Kansas to go through and approve those shorter training programs for federal workforce Pell eligibility. So how do they do it? It's going to be the governor and the state workforce development board getting together to determine which programs qualify. And really their goal in doing that is to make sure that these approved programs that they're going through are tied to real workforce needs here in Kansas. To try to not duplicate other funding streams would be a goal for them. So as they go through this, um, really it opens the door for students to use these federal funds for shorter job-focused trainings, not just those traditional degrees that you typically think of. So this next piece, again, it was another bill that was put into this bundle, really looks at the pipeline. So how do we get these high school students to demonstrate career readiness through tests like the ACT? So right now, the ACT work keys is already being distributed. Kids can take it, but how does it provide value? And that was kind of one of the key things when they were looking at it. Ultimately, this piece of the bill, um, well, I guess I should first start off, what is the work keys? What is it? What does it measure? How does it help students? So really, there's 3 main areas that it measures. It's applied math, reading for information, and then workforce problem solving. So that's what these kids are being tested when they take the ACT work keys. Now, when they take these, students can earn a National Career Readiness Certificate. So this is kind of graded in that bronze, silver, gold, platinum type level, and that's based on their performance on the test. So right now, when kids are using this, it's useful for employers, but not necessarily useful for if they're going to go into college. And so the goal of this bill was to really say, um, let's use those recognized credentials as college credit. And that's what this does. So technical degree programs can apply credit based on what you scored on the ACT work keys. And really, it's allowing students to not have to start from zero when they enter into college. They can take this and prove that have already mastered it, earn credit, and keep on going. And so, really reducing time and costs for these kids to be able to earn that degree faster because they've already proved that they've mastered those skills. So, the career readiness piece is obviously a very important aspect of all of this, but as we know, preparation starts a whole lot earlier. And to get to one of our bigger topics, if not the biggest topic, is literacy here in Kansas. So this was a part of the bundle, and it was the one of the larger parts of the bundle, sections 5 through 10. And it was making edits, additions to the Kansas Blueprint for Literacy. Again, this is a topic for its own webinar, but at a high level, I'll kind of give you what was passed in these 5 sections. Ultimately, it started with requiring the use of the science of reading statewide. With that, it also discredits methods like the 3Qing. Second, it requires reading specialists in all elementary schools starting in 2029-2030 school year. If you can believe we're already talking about the 2030 school year. Next, it mandates individual literacy plans for kids that are high risk K through 3, and that is based on what they scored on their fall screener. So hoping to get that intervention a little bit sooner. And in the bill, it actually did state that these interventions do have to include 90 minutes of reading per week for these students. Next, it adds stronger literacy expectations for teachers that are getting their licensure or just in preparation. And finally, this was a longer part of the bill, but it expanded the Literacy Advisory Committee's role. So really their goal is to create this comprehensive literacy implementation plan for the state. And so outlining kind of what their goal moving forward is that last section of the bill. So really this is fundamentally changing how literacy is taught in Kansas with the hopes of improving those test scores as we've seen and really aligning everything from teacher training to classroom intervention to evidence-based practices. We need all of the above, not just one. And so this really encapsulates all of that. This is the last portion of the bundle that we're going to discuss today. Really, I kept it for last because it's a cleanup bill more than anything. So the Kansas Promise Scholarship is something that's been around for a while. Nothing new here. Really, the biggest change to this was that it prohibits the use of these scholarship funds for remedial coursework or co-requisite courses. So really, it's focusing the funding on credit bearing and workforce aligned courses for these students who are receiving the scholarship funds. And I think this was ultimately a move back to what was initially intended with this with the taxpayer dollars. And so just a little bit of a cleanup bill, really ensuring that these scholarships are being used for what they were intended to. And that kind of wraps up the high level overview of the education bundle. Again, there were other aspects of this bill, and if that's something you would love to dive deeper into, our team would be more than happy to hop on a call and go through every one of those if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty of all of it. We are going to run through one more bill here, and that is last but not least, and certainly left to the very last hours of session here, the child care tax credit. So I'm sure you all are aware this is something that we've already had. And so what did they do? They expanded it for one. And so it's up to 75% of childcare expenses, which initially it was 30%. So it was a pretty big increase there. And the cap for businesses is at 100,000, whereas before it was 30. And so really what this does is just focus on expanding childcare access through employer incentives. It's something we've seen as underutilized, and so hoping that this is gaining more traction and more awareness for businesses. The other aspect that was added into this bill that changes a little bit of how the tax credit is used. It's the Community Child Care Investment Credit. So this was a portion that was added in, and really it's changing the question from how do employers help their employees to, okay, we're going to keep this part of it, but how do employers help expand childcare capacities within their community? So it's a little bit broader of a look at this. Under the new section that they added, businesses don't need to operate their own childcare center. Really, if they are willing to invest in existing childcare providers, help expand facilities, help pay for training, um, help support licensing costs, those are all things that would be eligible now under this new portion of the credit. So that is the new addition to this. We've had the childcare tax credit. Um, so really diving into this, and I think moving forward, especially with the implementation of this, is the awareness around it. So under helping businesses understand how do they use it, what is it, what are they eligible for, and right now this is probably one of the bigger pushes around fixing that childcare gap that we have across the state. So again, this will be something that we're tracking moving forward, but also looking at maybe different ways that we can impact this part of the system. All right. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Eric, and he's going to run through some of the high-level overview of some budget items that we saw in this year's budget. With that, Eric, go for it.
Thanks, Claudia. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Severson. It's nice to see you all, and thanks for joining us once again. Just high-level overview. For the state budget this year, the main takeaway is that education still remains one of the largest areas of state investment for Kansas. For this fiscal year, the total enacted budget was about $26.8 billion across all funding sources, which is about $10.7 billion in the state general fund. Within that $10 billion or the $26 billion, about $11.2 billion across all funds goes to education, and about $6.2 billion of the state general fund, so state received tax funds, goes to education. So of all funds, state education accounts for about 42% of the total state spending and about 60% of just state-specific spending from state revenues. This matters a lot because the budget ultimately sets the baseline as Kansas moves from this year to the next fiscal year for school finance discussions, which is especially important. We're creating a new school finance formula next year. So lawmakers are not starting from a blank slate. They are already making decisions with an already large education investment. So the debate now is shifting from how much money we're spending to how that is structured, targeted, and measured long-term during that process. I wanted to highlight just a few line items worth raising. The state agreed to an increased allotment for special education funding of $6 million, which brings up total state spending to $617 million for special education. That's lower than what the governor asked for, and that's lower than what some other legislators fought for, but ultimately they did increase it $6 million for the next 2 fiscal years. They also added $2.7 billion to the Blueprint for Literacy, which adds to something that Claudia was just talking about of continued state investment in literacy and thinking about and debating literacy policy, helping early literacy specifically, structured literacy programs, but also teacher support, and it hopes to help reading outcomes improve over the long term. On the higher education and workforce side, the budget includes about $20.7 million for technical and community colleges. This fits in line with one of the clearest themes that Claudia's brought up, which is stronger alignment between education, workforce needs. So how can we get more students the credentials, the apprenticeships, the training, and institutions that offer that? And so the state made a $20 million increased investment. Overall, the FY 2027 budget is a little lower than the FY 26 revised estimate budget. That leaves us about $2.2 billion, if I'm not mistaken, in the Budget Stabilization Fund or the state's rainy day fund. So we remain in a relatively strong reserve position as a state. And ultimately, like I said, the next thing that's going to be debated in terms of education and funding is how do we fund K-12 education in the state of Kansas as lawmakers look to resolve their requirement ultimately to have a new formula by next July. And with that, I think we're going to move into some Q&A. And I know, Claudia, we already have some questions, and I think I have some answers. Tiffany, for the first one, what reading screener did they